This is But Are There Dragons, a podcast where two friends pick a book at least one of them hasn't read and work their way through it a few chapters at a time.
I'm your host, Kritter.
And I'm your host, Jess.
And we're continuing this adventure with The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, with me as the resident Lord of the Rings veteran.
And I'm still a Tolkien first-timer.
In this, our first episode of Season 2, we're going to discuss the foreword, the prologue, and Chapter 1. Before we dive in, we need to introduce someone, our first ever guest, Roofmistress Leigh-A. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Leigh-A is a co-host of the Threefold Talk show, a weekly live stream usually about the Wheel of Time on the Malkier Talks YouTube channel, and a very good friend of But Are There Dragons podcast. Leigh-A, care to say a few words before we get started?
Just like you said, I'm one of the co-hosts. It's kind of a variety show. We do our show live Thursday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern. So if you're interested in the Wheel of Time, it is mostly full spoilers. Sometimes we do have guests that aren't full spoilers. So we do try to tailor those particular episodes to, whatever spoiler level. But anyways, come join us in chat if you can. Otherwise, hope to see you in the comments afterwards.
Perfect. Jessica, how are you feeling before we dive into episode 1 of season 2?
Sure. I think I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by the foreword, if I'm being honest.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
So the foreword kind of got me like, oh, this is a different game. We're in a different book.
It's the vibe was an immediate vibe shift, and we'll get into that for sure. So we just read The Hobbit. It's different. So let's just dive right in with the foreword. So the foreword basically gives us the backstory of the Fellowship, when Tolkien wrote it, what he was trying to do with it. So either of you feel free to share anything at all that stood out to you from this section. But one thing that we have talked about a bit already in past episodes is that Tolkien, quote, cordially dislikes allegory in all its manifestations. He basically says he'd rather readers have freedom to interpret his works instead of imposing his will on them. So any thoughts about this, Jessica, at least first? Should stories have intended meanings?
I think a story isn't necessarily for the author. A story is for the audience, or at least to say it means something different for the author than it does for the audience. And so
sure.
I think that it's great that he clarified that that wasn't the intent of his story, but that doesn't necessarily dictate how I get to perceive it when I review it. And this is something that had come up in our Discord conversation about how he really just kind of summarily dislikes allegory. So I thought that it was neat that it made it into this foreword. And I get it, but at the same time, I still don't think that discounts the fact that his perspective was influencing his writing. So even though it may not have been allegorical in nature, you can't pretend that your perspective doesn't influence what you write.
For sure. Leigh-A, any thoughts on this?
No, I agree with what Jessica said, and that authors' intentions, just like art, books are forms of art, and your intention as a writer doesn't mean that's how the people who read it and perceive it are going to think. So,
yeah. For sure. Tolkien indicated that the primary motive for writing The Lord of the Rings was to try to write a really long story that would hold people's attention, amuse them, delight them, and maybe move them. So Lord of the Rings basically being a writing exercise. It feels like really wrong to me, but I'm still very happy that it exists, right? Like, that's fine if that's what got us here, but it's kind of bizarre. I don't know. So Jessica, you said you were overwhelmed by the foreword. That's basically the only thing that I pulled out as something that I definitely wanted to talk about. Was there anything else from the foreword specifically that you wanted to address?
So there was a perspective. There was a lot of data, right? Like a lot of pure facts about, especially in the parts where he was refuting the allegorical nature of the story from his perspective when he wrote it, which I understand completely. You know, the date that it was started and how he was sending it off as serials to his son. And those were all very interesting, you know, factoids. There was another kind of underlying thread, which I also picked up on that comment that you made about it being a writing exercise and writing a really long story, but still managing to hold the audience. I thought that was kind of funny too. Yeah. The other thing is there are a couple of comments that are made in there that I highlighted where it almost sounds like the story was dictating what was happening. The story needed to happen to flesh out the Elven language. There's another one too. Hold on. My notes are not working. You know, they had to, the story, you know, branched this way and that, you know, meaning that, you know, anthropomorphizing the story itself and how it was dictating what needed to be said. And this mythology needed to be fleshed out. And I thought that that was very interesting in an otherwise, you know, kind of confusing forward. That was kind of fun in there that he was talking about. This is what the story needed to happen.
Leigh-A, did you enjoy the foreword? Is there anything else that stood out to you from it?
I just laughed when he said he wanted to write a long story, and I was like, oh, sweetie, you obviously haven't read The Wheel of Time. It's just like, that might have
been a long story. It's not, you know, up for interpretation at this point.
Yeah. And I'd actually never read the foreword before, so it was really interesting. And the audiobook that I had downloaded didn't have it, so as I was cramming, so it just started straight at chapter 1. So no, but it's fine because I do have the book, like my nice little, very well-loved, taped together book. Does have it, and I think I've always started at chapter 1. So the first 2 sections that we're going to be going through, I had never read before. I just thought it was the mumbo jumbo of like the beginning. And so it was great to go through that. I'd heard a lot of his story before, so a lot of stuff that was in the foreword wasn't necessarily new information to me, but it was good to look at what he had written and his purpose.
I think I'm on the same page as you that I don't recall reading either the prologue or the foreword. Other than I know that I read part of the prologue whenever I was doing research on pipeweed for a TikTok. But other than that, like, I'm not certain, because whenever I read this, you know, for the first time, or I think both times that I read it was in grade school, and grade school
and why would you? You would just
not at all interested in any of that stuff. Like too facty, too historical, not the fun stuff. I don't know.
I did a reread about 15 years ago. It was right after I moved to DC. And I know for a fact that I did not read the prologue or the foreword on that read. So
that brings me, I was going to ask, we should have started with your credentials, right? How many times have you read it, Leigh-A?
I read it, I think in either elementary or middle school, and then again in high school. And then I had reread them before the movies came out. So that was around college age. So, you know, 3 or 4 times before I graduated from college. And then the most recent reread was 15 years ago. When I first moved to DC. Because I very specifically I very specifically remember renting the Netflix extended version where they sent you the CDs.
Yes.
Nice.
So I would finish the book and then rent the extended version via Netflix CDs.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And we, even just reading chapter 1, we already know that the movies leave so much out.
Yes.
And I had forgotten, but I guess we're not on chapter 1 yet, so
we're not. I did have one other thing that was really early in the foreword that kind of got me right in the feels, not expecting it, because I was expecting the foreword just to be kind of dates and bits and things. Till I stood by Balin's tomb in Moria. And so we kind of got pretty fond of Balin during the Hobbit read. That's still pretty fresh. And so for that to just jump up off the page at me, and I'm sure I knew that Balin was in Moria. I'm sure I knew that, but just reading it in that sentence felt very cold. Like,
I didn't okay, so this is so funny because I just did a rewatch for my birthday party, and I noticed in the movies, I want to say they read Balin like whenever they were in the mines, and I was like, oh my god, I didn't put two and two together. Like, this is the ballad from The Hobbit.
So that's what I'm saying. So I didn't rewatch because I'm being a good first time girly.
Good job,
but I want to. But reading it, in the foreword, I got really kind of upset. I was like, oh god, there's an aspect of it I didn't even think about that
should live forever.
Balin should live forever.
Yeah, seriously.
I was not expecting ghosts of the past to jump at me in the foreword.
Yeah. Well, here we are. He was out to get you. Okay, so anything else in the foreword before we move on to the prologue? Everybody good to go?
Double check. I think we're good.
No rush.
Yeah, no, it's all the same. Oh, and then that that was the one that I had highlighted, is that the story put down roots into the past and threw out unexpected branches. And I had highlighted that as my umami bit from, a relatively, what could be characterized as a dry forward, right? And I was like, even here, his storyteller shows through.
We have for those listening and not watching, we have a cat visitor with Leigh-A. What's the kitty's name?
This is Wilder.
Wilder.
Wilder is a YouTube veteran. He has appeared on many streams.
Well, he is. And there's another one.
Yeah, there's Paka.
Paka? Yeah. Oh my gosh, amazing. Okay, so let us continue to the prologue. Concerning Hobbits section first. So we learn a lot about the Hobbits in this section, so feel free to chime in with anything that stood out to you. But I noted a few things, including that the Hobbits essentially have 3 breeds: the Harfoots, the Stores, and the Fallowhides. We met the Harfoots in Rings of Power. Yeah. So that brings me to Leigh-A. Did you watch that, and did you like the Harfoot spot?
Yes, because I just assumed all of that information from the Rings of Powers from the Silmarillion, which I have not read.
And they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion, so none of it is.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, they have to pull everything from little bits and pieces from the trilogy like this.
Oh, I just assumed it was all the Silmarillion.
No.
And I was just like, so this is how I know I've never read the prologue, is because I got so excited. It's like, I remember this.
Yeah. So the Harfoots, obviously, they have very Hobbit vibes, and they had Hobbit vibes, and so when we find out, they're just, Hobbit ancestors, it makes a lot of sense. So I said a lot of history here, dates, names, events. This section to me read a bit like a history book, a bit like some parts of the Silmarillion. So, Jessica, did you internalize a lot of this, or did your eyes glaze over, kind of?
Probably somewhere in the middle. Like, I took a lot of highlights to be able to go back and reference them. Things that jumped off the page, they mention a red book that sounds like it might be Bilbo's version of There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Holiday, but I'm not 100% sure. It talks about the background on the hobbits themselves. It talks about all kinds of things that you just alluded to. Oh, the other thing that really got me right off the page was year 1 of the Shire, and all dates are based on it. So, and that, there is in fact a hierarchy, if you will, a government structure, or there was, and it's just been so unnecessary that it's really kind of ceremonial at this point in their world, which I understood. So I would say that go ahead.
I was just because this is what we're talking about, I just want to jump in. So there's a fun little fact that I discovered. So the Hobbits also, they have a Thane as their leader, which is an interesting word. Thane is one of those words that I wasn't familiar with, but I looked it up. It is an Old English word for minor noble and was used in Shakespeare's Macbeth. So now you know. Sorry, Jessica, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just
No, that's fine. That word jumped off the page to me because of the Shakespeare connection.
Oh, so you recognized it, because I did not.
I did, in context of like Thane in my mind was similar to like Laird in Scottish, you know, they're a minor noble, they're you know, it's a position of authority, but essentially middle management.
Yeah, well, hobbits aren't going to be that lofty.
But then it was just more of that, right? Like going through and reading it and seeing what they were talking about for the background, talking about their height, talking about how you know, those three ancestors, the Harfoots, the Stores, and the Fallowhides, were between the Greenwood and the Misty Mountains before they made their trek, which, you know, is somewhat alluded to in the Rings of Power. So yeah, I found it interesting, but I certainly wouldn't say I returned it all.
Yeah, no, that's
I mean, retained
fair.
it all, returned it all. I'm returning it. I'm giving it back.
Leigh-A, did you have any fun concerning Hobbits facts that stood out to you?
I really enjoyed going back and checking out where things are on the map, just because it has been such a while. And we do see a lot more of the world here. So I just wanted to start familiarizing myself with the names. And of course, they changed the name. So I'm like, where is the Greenwood? And then I read 2 sentences down. It's like, oh, yeah, no, it's the Merkshire, of course. So of course,
it's
have
not multiple names.
or the Mirkwood's not the Mirkwood, not the Merkshire. Like, so I'm just like staring at this map forever, and my eyes are glossing over because of words. Like, the print isn't great on the maps. It's like, it's fine. I don't care anymore.
I love that the Hobbits have their own way to do a lot of things, including Jessica. You mentioned the years, right? It's like there's like everybody else in their system of keeping time, and then there's the Hobbits, and like I want to say in one of these sections it was either Merry or Pippin that had developed a system of reconciliation for the years. Like the amount,
and I thought that was awesome, because I was like, there's such, my perception of them, and we all know that my perception is faulty, and we're putting a pin in it after our experiences with Thorin. My perception aside, you know, I have this in my mind that Merry and Pippin are kind of, I know they go through a transformation, but they're really kind of like troublemaking teens in spirit. So the idea of one of them doing this kind of steeped in academia paper or book that outlines the different ways of keeping time across different cultures is hilarious to me.
Yeah, it was unexpected for sure. So we also learn a lot about Hobbit living spaces. So, for example, the chief remaining peculiarity of Hobbit architecture is round windows and doors. We also learn it's quite common for Hobbit families to live many generations together in many tunneled smeals, which is the name for Hobbit holes. So, would you all want to live this way in a smeal with multiple generations of your family? Would you prefer the newer way of Hobbit living in above-ground normal brick or stone houses? Or what about how Bilbo and Frodo lived, so still in a hobbit hole, but solo?
Bilbo and Frodo.
Okay. The solo hobbit hole life is what it sounds like for everybody else. Honestly, I'm like, you know, I've always liked the idea of like community living, but I can't say that I would be like me and my extended family. You know, that's who I want to live in. No offense to them. I love them. But like,
I do feel like, yeah, if they lived in a couple houses over, or like all of that sort of stuff, and I actually did really appreciate, and I don't remember which section it was. It's when they were talking about the postmasters, that they write their friends and sometimes family. So like there was a very big distinction that they're writing to their friends and not their family. And I think that's the community living that I want, like the chosen family, the people I want to write with and have.
That's what I mean. With. Yeah.
Amazing.
I would live in a smeal with my chosen family. That sounds fun.
So I will say, with my circle of friends, we've talked about, you know, jokingly about having a commune, right? And really it would be like 2 massive houses and then some shared spaces, you know, like not necessarily Not necessarily we're all living in the same bathroom, because that's going to strain any relationship.
No. We don't necessarily share walls. We don't share bathrooms, but we do live near each other. That's the dream, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we move on to Pipeweed, any other thoughts about concerning hobbits?
No, I don't think so. They did talk about, I did find it interesting that they have the museum. They talked about them having accumulated so much stuff that was it called a matham? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
That sounds right.
Matham. Somebody can correct me. You know, and putting things in the museum that are important. So I think one of my takeaways from this is that hobbits are a little hoardery.
Yeah. They're a little hoardery. I agree. And so it was interesting to note, I think in that context, they say that they haven't fought wars in a long, long time. They had a war that they had to fight against orcs ages ago. But so there's still weapons in the Shire, but a lot of them are in this matham or like hanging on the mantelpiece
and
above the fire.
And apparently centuries old, because this war predated the establishment of the Shire, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so old weapons, but weapons, they're not completely weaponless, so that's something. I don't know. Yeah, so.
I do think that there's two more things, sorry.
Yeah, don't be sorry.
One is, to you, Kritter, there's some commentary in there about the appropriateness of the question in the riddle game, which immediately made me think of you.
Yep.
So I was like highlighting all of that. So, you know, it's called into question, but once Gollum accepted it, it became fair play.
Because because like the dwarves, hobbits are like semi-contractual in nature. And so I appreciated that clarification. And
I thought it might make it more palatable to you. Yeah.
And I tended to, that's how I rationalized it at the time, you know, in the chapter, The Riddles in the Dark, but still, I wish it would have gone down differently. And apparently, we'll find out soon, so did Bilbo, because he told people it went down differently.
Yeah.
Yes, that was shocking.
This section makes the first reference to the story that he told each person might be different. And then the last thing from this part of the foreword was reference to Thane Peregrine Took. I assume Peregrine Took. So I was like, okay, it's a little bit of like the Eagle King is going to get crowned. I felt like that was very foreshadowing.
Okay, I was wondering if you felt like you shouldn't have read this because some of it felt a little spoilery.
I mean, a little, but overall still worth it. I like the factoids about the story, right? Like, it's a really old story, and getting that context, you know, I don't know if I can call myself a bibliophile, but as a story lover, having some of the background, you know, from the horse's mouth, I love that. And I love the fact that a bunch of this is at the request of the readers, right? The readers wanted to know more about the hobbits, and he took the time to create this lore. So I wanted to read it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad because there were a couple things, like, I guess you saw the movie, so you know that like Merry and Pippin survive at least in the movie. So that would have revealed it if you hadn't seen the movies. Okay, so the next section of the prologue is the ordering of the Shire, and we've alluded to some of this stuff. So so as far as the leadership in the Shire, we find out that the High King, once recognized by the hobbits, was 1,000 years gone. The Tooks apparently inherited a place of special respect, and the chief Took is considered the Thane, hence Peregrine Took the Thane. They're basically in charge of military efforts, which means the title is basically out of respect, which you mentioned. And then there's also a mayor who is in charge of the post and the sheriffs. And I don't know about you guys, but I think the word sheriff is the cutest word of all time. Sheriff. I don't know why, but it just like strikes me as like, I can see like a little, you know, in oh my gosh, Lord Brocktree, or one of the you know, the books where there are animals that are little knights. Redwall. That strikes me as a word from Redwall, and I'm gonna move on from there. So anyways, the sheriffs are basically the neighborhood watch and the animal control all rolled into one. So that's basically my summary of the ordering of the Shire. Did you have anything, Leigh-A, that stood out to you from this section?
At first I was questioning that they had like a police force, and I was like,
Uh-huh.
really, this sounds so un-Hobbit-like. But when they did mention it was more for like it's more for the animals, I was like, oh, that makes sense. Because somebody's lazy and gonna complain that their goats got out and not go do anything about it. So that's what the sheriffs are for.
Exactly.
Somebody's dog is maliciously watering somebody else's plants.
Exactly. Yeah. Very Hobbity of their, like, and that's why I called it their neighborhood watch. It's like, not really police.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's only 3 per little section. So there's only 12 total.
Right. Yeah. Chasing down goats and not much else, basically. Jessica, did
really,
you have
what
anything?
trouble's getting up into in the Shire?
Nobody's doing anything except gossiping. I found out because man, they like to gossip.
Not breaking any laws.
It's true. It's true.
I'm trying to see the section, not on the Shire, the section on Old Toby. Did we skip that?
Oh, we did. Jessica, good catch. Good catch. Okay, but
but I brought it up because like I was surprised.
That we skipped it?
No, I was surprised that it was tobacco.
Oh, okay. Yes. So that's so funny because the first question that I have under concerning pipeweed is there's a whole section about smoking. Are we surprised? And me, after reading The Hobbit, not really, not really super surprised, but were you excited to read about this strain of probably nicotania?
I feel like it speaks to that Hobbit culture again, right? Like they have this plant, regardless of what the plant's used for, that they've brought with them and they've nourished and they've grown, and it's part of their history. So I think that that's really neat. It also kind of lays the groundwork for later. There's some actual respect for Gandalf's smoking abilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bilbo admired them as well back in The Hobbit.
Yes. So I think that it's funny. I think that it's similar in theme to appreciating a well-appointed pantry, right? I think that it's part and parcel of the culture for them as a whole, and that they carried it with them. And lots of cultures bring plants with them when they're uprooted or when they relocate. So uprooted.
So I mentioned it's worth noting that the narrator says the Hobbit's pipeweed is a variety of nicotania, which means tobacco. After some study, and I've done a TikTok about this, I've concluded that Tolkien, who was an avid pipe smoker, like he loved the hobby, considered pipeweed to be tobacco. But I think Peter Jackson and the actors in The Lord of the Rings played it as cannabis.
Yes.
Discuss. Yes.
Yes. So I will say that based on those, I did think that it was cannabis. I had made the assumption that Old Toby was cannabis. And honestly, I didn't know you had done a TikTok about it. I don't know how it missed my
it's one
radar.
of my more popular Lord of the Rings.
Cool.
Shocker.
Shocker. Yeah.
So I can say, and also everybody's a little bit different on their take on cannabis. Cannabis is kind of normalized in some of the areas that I've lived in.
So it's legal in a lot of states, and so there's it's getting more and more normalized.
But there are other parts of the country where it's still, not viewed that way. So I think that it's a matter of what you've been exposed to about whether or not you would make that leap.
Yeah. Yeah, be willing to. Yeah, I feel like their behavior while smoking it in the movie is like, this is clearly what they were going for. And I think it's really funny. And like, it's goofy, it's laid back. They like the Hobbits,
exactly.
Are always eating. There's just a lot of stereotypes involved, which I think are really funny. And of course, whenever I did this TikTok, like a lot of people were like, "You're right, definitely, it's marijuana," and then a lot of other people were like, Tolkien wouldn't have even known what marijuana is. It's like, it's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that Tolkien thought that's what it was. I'm just saying that there's a difference in interpretation between Tolkien and Peter Jackson. So yeah, fun fact. Okay, cool. So we talked about this, but Mary who we haven't met yet in the book, but we keep hearing little snippets of in the prologue, is both the expert on pipeweed and also quite sure and proud that hobbits were the first folk to decide to smoke it. Other people were familiar, but they were the ones that were like, we're going to light this on fire and inhale it, right? Leigh-A, did you have any thoughts about this section generally? Because I thought it was fun and informative, but, obviously not terribly relevant to the overall plot.
Especially with a Peter Jackson interpretation that it's weed. I was like, and of course Perry's the one writing about the history of their strain of weed that they're smoking. So like that is such a merry thing to do. And and it like and just how particular they are about it. Like it's this one strain and they're not really sure where it came from, and this one dude never left, but he might have gone to Bree, and then maybe they got it from somewhere else in Bree. It's just like, but he would never told anybody where he got it. Like so like,
and I think that kind of adds to it, right? Like the whole strain and the horticulture piece of it.
Exactly.
If anybody's known anybody who has legally grown cannabis, then they're very horticulturally inclined, and you're very attentive to what strain you're growing and like so all of that absolutely smacked of cannabis.
The old Toby, the long bottom leaf, they all, it's is that more indica or sativa? You could hear Merry ask Pippin, or probably conversely Pippin ask Merry that about something, right? Because Merry's apparently the expert.
For sure. Absolutely.
So I thought that was it was cute. It was a cute section. I'm glad it's in there.
I wasn't looking forward to reading it. I was like, oh my God, like what is this going to be? And then I was like, oh, that's actually kind of interesting. Like probably never need to read this again, but cool.
It's fun to know. It is fun to know.
I did it once.
Okay, so we skipped ahead to Ordering of the Shire, but Jessica didn't get to weigh in on it at all because she pointed out that we had skipped the pipeweed section. Was there anything you wanted to talk about from Ordering the Shire, or are you content?
I think I'm good. I think that old Toby was the one that stuck out for me. Those were the big notes that I had.
Okay. All right, so then let's move on to the prologue section of the Finding of the Ring. So part of this section is basically the Hobbit's Riddles in the Dark chapter, which we just read. We talked about that in season 1, episode 2 of But Are There Dragons, if you want to check it out and didn't watch or listen to season 1. So we find out, though, which we alluded to earlier, that Bilbo perpetuated a lie about these events and tried to convince people that he essentially won the ring, what he, like Gollum, called a present by winning the game of riddles. So as far as I know, this doesn't show up in any of the movies. So Jessica, did it catch your attention since I assume
absolutely.
You didn't know about it?
If it was in the movies, I totally did not catch up. I did not catch it. That there was different stories that he was telling to different people. And reading through that section to find out that that's what he told the dwarves when he came clean after the orc encounter was kind of wild. I was like, oh, so he told them that the ring existed, but he still lied about it.
Yeah. Not exactly forthcoming. So Leigh-A, we didn't have guests in season 1 whenever we talked about the finding of the ring and everything. Do you have any thoughts about that section of the whole story?
Well, so the way I did this, the reading for this episode, it was completely backwards. So I listened to chapter 1 because I was traveling a lot and I was very nervous about like ruining this book. So I didn't want to pull it in and out of my bags at the airport a lot. And so in chapter 1, that the changing of the story is alluded to, and I was like, wait, what? It's like, I literally just read The Hobbit and I don't remember this. So I was like really confused. So going back and reading this portion, which I kind of breezed through because I was like, oh my God, I just read The Hobbit. I was like, wait, what? Hold on. Rewind 2 paragraphs. What's going on? So it was kind of eye-opening to be like, why did Bilbo change it? And I'm sure once we get into chapter 1, we'll discuss, but how Frodo and Gandalf are both like, that's just so unlike him to like, why would he lie about that? It just doesn't even make any sense. Like the way the story is, it doesn't even make it a better story. So if you're just trying to make it a better story, that's very un-Bilbo. And having this in the prologue explain that he did it, not necessarily his reasons for doing it.
Yeah. So for the people who are only listening, not watching on YouTube, can you give us the alt text for the book that you have?
Yes. So it is a paperback book that was printed in the 1970s. It has no cover because the cover has somehow been completely ripped off, and the binding is tape that I put on it, and several of the outer pages the edges are very rough.
It's a very well-loved book.
The pages are very yellow.
Like so yellow. I can't even, like mustard yellow.
Like many of us who survived the 70s, okay? We are all forever changed.
Yeah, that book is fabulous. You sent a picture of it in the Discord,
yes,
right?
I put it in your Discord.
Okay, well, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to plug my Discord, where we have a But Are There Dragons channel, where we talk about things like hilarious old books and things that come up in the podcast. So if you're not on the Discord yet, you should hop in. So let's see. What else?
I'd like to point out what Leigh-A mentioned, though, about how even though we're fresh off The Hobbit, there was new content in that summary in the foreword, or prologue, rather. So I wasn't reading backwards, but I was kind of caught off guard going through it, thinking it wasn't going to be anything different. And there certainly was. I thought that was kind of neat, that you wouldn't have to have read The Hobbit necessarily to read this book, but also if you could be caught unawares, if you just assumed and kind of rest on your laurels, there is information in there that isn't necessarily on the page in The Hobbit.
Yeah, I had totally forgotten that part about it from, way back in the day when I read it as a wee little lass. Okay, so final section of the prologue, a note on Shire records. So, I'm not going to lie, a section in a book about a fake world discussing how fake people have kept the fake records of fake histories. That is not always going to capture my attention. And this section was no exception. So did anything stand out to either of you? Like, feel free to chime in, because I did my best. I'll say that.
I kind of got confused about like the different versions of the Red Book, and because there's like versions that haven't been published, but versions that haven't also that Frodo didn't touch, that Bilbo, and I was just like, okay, wow,
that have been appended by elves at some point, apparently.
Yes.
Like,
He's like, can we call it something besides the Red Book if there's different versions?
It's all the Red Book.
It's all the Red Book.
The Red Book is basically the Shire Bible. There's a lot of versions.
Yeah, it was in Origin, Bilbo's private diary. So I had highlighted and wound up giving up halfway through. So I will say that someone who has gone so deep as to create a mythological filing system for a mythological place, for a mythological people, gets mad props. I'm just like, I love the bookophile in you. So I had a lot of respect for that, because I think that it kind of shows Tolkien's origins, right? Like, he's a college professor, and any forensic look at a culture would require you to evaluate how they kept their records and pass things down. So it would be second nature for him, right? To kind of evaluate how this culture kept and passed forward its records. So I thought that was very cute in its own way, although I can understand why it'd be a super, super dry read. But I also got so in the weeds with the Red Book story, and it's the Thane's book, and it was at Minas Tirith, which is again a detail I don't remember ever hearing about before, so I look forward to seeing what that means. And I wound up just giving up, right? Like, I don't actually know the provenance of the book, or if it is there and back again, or I gave up. I got lost in the weeds.
That's fair. I basically, so there was one thing that I I don't want to say there was one thing that I found interesting, but the one thing that I noted was about Celeborn, who is Galadriel's husband. He didn't go to the Grey Havens when Galadriel did. He stayed behind for some unknown period of time. But then when he left, he took the last living memory of the Elder Days in Middle-earth. And I found that to be so interesting because it's like, it was almost like sad, you know, like he was basically the last super old ancient elf to be in Middle-earth. So also when I hear Celeborn, I think, when are we going to meet him in the Rings of Power? And because it's just like something that's, you know, obviously ongoing and new and fresh, and we don't actually know the answer to that. So that's what stood out to me from this from this section. So that's the foreword, that's the prologue. We've talked about them both. Are you all prepared to move to chapter 1, or are there any final thoughts?
I'm good for chapter 1.
Okay. We did it. Well done, all. Like, that was not the core story, and so the fact that we got through it, and Jessica, I will say that if we decide to read the Silmarillion as part of this podcast, you now have a taste. Just a taste of what it's like. In some ways. There are stories, but there are also sections that are like this. So that's all.
So what I'll say, and this can be a rhetorical question, but I'm like, or a rhetorical comment rather, it's more likely to hold my interest if it's got enough about characters I've already learned about. So for example, this held me because I did see mention of Peregrine and I did see mention of Mary. And even Celeborn, right? Who I haven't met yet, but I've at least heard of. So if the Silmarillion is just all of these characters I've never heard of, then it might be difficult. But if it's at least some characters I've heard of, then I might be able to stick it out.
Get on board. Yeah. It'll be an adventure. I'm looking forward to it. But first, we are on book 1, chapter 1, An Unexpected Party. And that's kind of like, it's a fun little parallel because the first chapter of The Hobbit was, God, what was the title? It was like An Unexpected Journey, or no, what?
It was An Unexpected Journey, and I think the last one was An Unexpected Visitor. But now I want to double check.
Yeah. I can't remember. I just thought it was like, it sounded so familiar, basically, compared to what we were getting in The Hobbit. So I kind of noted that. I should have checked, but I noted it. Whatever. So, Bilbo the Hobbit is about to have a birthday party. We find out that he has designated Frodo his cousin, his heir, and that the two share a birthday, September 22nd, just 78 years apart. Frodo is coming of age at 33, and Bilbo is turning 111.
I love that they called it tweens, like when they're in their 20s, the tweens. And I was like, yes, is that why we call them the tweens?
So
I was not prepared for coming of age at 33. Like I knew that I knew that was probably the landscape that we were in, given that at 51 or whatever, Bilbo was still a little wet behind the ears.
A little.
But Tolkien comes right out and says, coming of age is 33. And I was like, holy smokes.
Yeah. Hey, that's okay. As far as I'm concerned, people in their 20s are still pretty green.
Yeah.
Even as humans.
Like I became an adult in my 30s.
Yeah.
I mean, I did too, but still.
Still, just to have it out there on the table like that.
Yeah. Like, don't call me out like that, bro. For the record, the last chapter, I was wrong. The first chapter of The Hobbit, you are correct, is An Unexpected Journey.
And so this is An Unexpected Party. So that's so cool. I like that. Like having read, reading them really close to each other, just kind of.
This is the long expected party.
The long expected party. Wait, I wrote down An Unexpected Party because I had it in the back of my brain. That is so funny. Okay, so still, it still parallels really well from
absolutely.
An Unexpected Journey to The Long Expected Party. Thank you for that correction, though. I'm sure people would have gotten angry.
Yeah. I mean, we do want to be accurate.
Get ahead of the comments. Get ahead of the comments.
We do want to be accurate. We strive for accuracy here. So there are tons of rumors and tons of prep as the party approaches, because Bilbo, again, turning 111. So did anything stand out to you from the part leading up to the party? Like, how do you feel about the story as it's beginning? The party prep.
The notoriety that he's got tunnels full of treasure. So, we started to see some of that groundwork get laid when we left Bilbo off, and having to prove that he is in fact alive and all of that. But it sounds like over the intervening 60 years or whatever, the notoriety and the local lore has just grown. There is still Sackville Baggins's slander, so I'm here for it. I am here for the family gossip. Bring it. I want the tea. Yeah, and then the other thing, hobbits have a passion for family history. I don't know why, but that just struck me, and I thought that was very cute. And it also kind of emphasizes that Bilbo and Frodo are kind of different in that they're bachelors and they live alone. It gets touched on in the chapter as well, but how singular they are in that way. And then it was at this point in the chapter where I was, there's a comment about the art of Gandalf had improved with age, and I went, time out. Is he the same age as Bilbo?
Gandalf?
So, yeah, because 60 years passed for him too. So he's not just a mere mortal then, because he's got to be at least 100 years old.
Gandalf.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's a wizard.
Yeah, but okay.
Okay, no, you're learning. Sorry, you're learning. You're learning things. Okay, so describe to me. All right, sorry. I'm trying to figure out, like...
So I think that... I don't think that it said anywhere that if you're a wizard, you have unnaturally long life. I don't think that was spelled out. Not that it has to be. And that's a facet of a lot of fantasy stories that I've read today. I try not to bring those assumptions with me into this story, especially since it's older.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, but it wasn't until that moment where I was like, holy cow, he's 60 years has passed for him as well. So he's got to be at least as old as Bilbo.
And he was described as like an old man in The Hobbit. So older by at least a little, some, because Bilbo was like 50 or whatever in The Hobbit. So at the time, Gandalf was already old man level, and so he's still old man level. Just 60 years older or whatever. Okay, that's interesting. I'm glad that you pointed that out, because I never would have thought, like...
I totally get. I don't mean to be snarky with my face. Like, I get where you're coming from. Like, he's a wizard.
No, but why would you know what that means? Yeah, like Harry Potter's a wizard too, and that kid was 11. Like, so you never know. To be fair, I get it. Okay, well done. Good.
Dumbledore and Gandalf look surprisingly alike.
Yes, especially in my headcanon.
Okay. Tolkien did it first. So for me in this section, it was the world building. Like, we find out more about the hobbits. They're gossipy. They're not fond of change or strangers. They're super fond of parties and food. So at just this building up to the party, I comfortably settled into the Shire once again. I thought Tolkien did a really good job of just like tucking us in personally.
I love the descriptions of the setup for the party, because I love throwing parties, and so just like the descriptions of everything coming in and how the tents were just like going up overnight, so like just trying to suddenly surprise people and keep facets under wraps, and the delightful little sign of Bilbo being a crotchety old man not wanting anybody come into his house unless it's on party business.
I don't think you can see it, but I actually have the no admittance except on party business right there. It's just cut off in this particular view. I love it.
I thought it was good. I do like the return to the cozy vibe, starting off cozy kind of like we did before. I love that, but I will say cozy with the asterisk though, because I could feel not necessarily the anxiety, but the energy that builds around throwing that party and knowing that it's for like 150 people. Like, that's huge. That's a huge party.
There's some, that's about a little smaller than the size of my wedding. It's a big party.
It's a big wedding.
It's 100. You said 150?
144.
Okay, yeah. Mine is like 160, but so it's close. It's pretty close.
Yeah. So that was kind of wild. So I did think that it was good to go back to the Shire, and it felt just as cozy, but I felt like it was more of a build-up than, say, in the movie intro, even though we know that we're going into the movie intro for the party. I felt like that frenetic energy build was a little bit more evident in the writing.
Yeah. I also feel like it was more so for example, they mentioned how there were orders from like outside the Shire and like they were bringing things in, and then like it was just like, lest people say that I'm not ordering local, those orders started to go out closer to the party. It was just like so I don't know.
And he had cleaned everybody out, right? Like he had ordered much stuff. Yes. He had cleaned everybody out.
Yeah. Those little details make me laugh. Just the like, lest anyone accuse me of not supporting local.
Yeah, very local.
Like, I love it.
Like, I get that vibe. Like, shop local, everybody.
Especially in the Shire. So the party starts. We find out that the Hobbits actually give presents to other people on their birthdays, not the opposite, which is so fun. Overall,
unless you invite 144 people to your party.
That's a lot of presents. That's a lot of presents. It's like the party favors, but like a lot. So it sounds like a heck of a party, in my opinion. I definitely would have loved to be there. Any favorite moments or lines, Leigh-A? Anything that you liked?
It just lasted so long. It lasted from before 11sies all the way up through supper, and then it kept going. Like that is no wonder because that is not just one meal. No wonder everybody's complete stores were wiped out. Is because that's like 5 meals. And I'm sure and that's when they were all sitting. So I'm sure they were just constantly stuffing their faces because they're hobbits.
Yes.
Sounds amazing. That was like my birthday party, actually. We started right after 11sies, actually. So we had luncheon, afternoon tea, dinner, supper, and like dessert. So I was really full at the end of the day. But it was a lot of, and then of course there was food sitting out like the whole, like chips and whatnot. So it was very hobbity and it was really fun. But
sounds amazing.
By the time
you can't do it every day. You can't do it every day.
When it came time for me to have my birthday cake, which was the final thing, I had like half a piece, which for me is like, I love birthday cake, and I couldn't even eat it because I was so full. So that was something else. Jessica, did you have any from the party? Anything you liked?
From the party, I really liked. There was a comment. All of my notes are from during the speech and right after. So first off, another shout out to you, Kritter. The time I remember and could only say thank you very much when he had the cold. So again, a little bit of a callback because I remember Kritter loving that moment in the Hobbit. So I thought it was kind of funny that it got a call out. And so, I've been with these movies longer than I've been with the Hobbit movies, not quite to the extent that Kritter has, but I also was somebody that watched every year. I've seen the extended edition multiple times. And I did think that there were some great big beats in the speech that did make it into the movie.
Like line verbatim. For line. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that. I love that when I can pick it out like that. But then of course there's other things that were there, like the thank you very much, I thought was very neat. And then I think that it's the aftermath that I liked the most on this chapter. So there's not really any discussion of it in the movie, but Frodo's just sitting there and quiet. And even though he was in on it, he still didn't quite know what to think. And he wasn't just immediately rambunctious or loud like the others. He was kind of quiet and sat with it a minute and goes, oh, what does this actually mean? And so I thought that was great. And again, I say it all the time, there are certain things that just jump off the page at me, and that's one that I was like, okay, this kid is paying attention.
Well, also in the movie, I don't think he was in on the secret, right? No. And so that was an interesting difference, that like in the book he was in on it, kind of. He knew that Bilbo was going to pull this disappearing act, and in the movie, at least based on how Elijah Wood played it, he did not. He was not expecting
and he has a line where he says, okay, keep your secrets then. So
yes.
I can quote the movie. It's ridiculous. Probably not to the extent you can. But, So I think the aftermath is the part I liked about this. So, and it's not to take away from the importance of Gandalf talking Bilbo off the ledge and getting him to leave the ring behind and how important that was, making sure that it was Frodo that took the ring. Also, here in the book, it expressly states aloud that in that moment is when Gandalf started researching the ring. You're kind of left to wonder, has he looked into this before? Where it's expressly stated in this chapter. And then he leaves to go and look into it. But then all of the aftermath at the Hobbit hole after the fact, Gandalf's taken off, Bilbo's gone, and Frodo's left to essentially fight off being pillaged by his friends and neighbors.
Where were the sheriffs? That's what I want to know. Where were the sheriffs? Is all this shit's getting stolen?
He's got people in the pantry and down corridors digging holes because they thought they could hear a hollow point. I'm like, that's insane. Can you imagine? Can you imagine having to physically fight off your relatives, your in-laws?
That is so audacious. I was very upset with the Hobbits community at this point, where they're just like, oh, well, it's like stolen treasure, so we can steal it if we find it, right?
Right. It's all fair. You'd expect it from a Sackville Baggins, but not necessarily from the rest.
Anyway. So going back to the speech, there was a moment where there was this old hobbit who was like, he read into the trick and he was like, I think he's sensing that Bilbo's going to leave again, right? But he concluded that it didn't matter because he didn't take the victuals with him. So that to me was so Hobbit. Like literally he's like, oh, I'm one of the smart ones, but also doesn't matter because that cake right there, it's still right there and I'm going to have a piece. I thought that was pretty fabulous. So, Jessica kind of walked us through all of it.
Sorry.
No, not at all. I'm happy. You should. It's great. I had a great time listening to that. So, one thing that I really liked, a line from Bilbo that's in both the movies and the books that I find myself using pretty often is the one about him being old, feeling thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. So it's dramatic, but when I'm tired, I use that all the time. Like, and it's a very, Tolkien, people who aren't familiar are like, what is this fluffy language that you're using? So anyway, Jessica described it already. Gandalf and Bilbo, they have this tense exchange about the ring. Leigh-A, did you have any standout moments from this?
I appreciated that Bilbo had several dwarves just in the back coming, and that he didn't leave by, and not only did he plan this, he brought travel companions. So, because I always forget in the books that he has this, because he just kind of takes off on his own in the movies. And it's like, it's kind of sad. Like, you're so used to traveling with people. And it does mention, both in The Hobbit and here, that he did continue to go visit with his elven friends and his dwarf friends. So I was very happy that they weren't named, so I'm assuming that it's not from anyone from the original 13 that he set off with, but it means he made more friends, and he's going out and seeing the world with his buddies. So I love that.
Got the Tolkien bug, I think, because I was like, I wanted their names. It's like, who are these dwarves that are with Bilbo? I need to know.
I know. I was very curious, but
there was one other aspect of Aftermath I wanted to mention. Is they actually spent time to go out in the garden and wake up people who didn't make it home.
And brought them out in wheelbarrows. They, like, the gardeners took them out in wheelbarrows. Was so good.
By orders, per orders. Like, that was built into the party plan.
That was a good note. I think I thought I wrote it down, but I didn't, so I'm glad you brought it up. Also, I noted, so Bilbo calling the ring his precious, right? Which is like in the movies, he's like, it's been called that before. Gandalf is like, what? Like, you could see the little exclamation mark above his head in this scene, just like, what is happening? This is I just found it to be a really well-written conversation where you could see the kind of sinister vibes just surrounding Bilbo. He's clearly been corrupted. And even if you hadn't seen the movies, you'd know there was something going on. And I just love that was just, Tolkien nailed it.
that conversation is such an important lead up to the one that Gandalf and Frodo have, talking about, did you hear the true origin of the story, and the conversation that I'd already mentioned about why did he change it? And so just like those two conversations are complementary, and that there's something weird going on here.
Yeah, for sure.
I will point out, though, that the Peter Jackson treatment of that, the Bilbo and Gandalf interaction, getting him to leave the ring, was a little bit more sinister than how it read on the page necessarily. And I think that that was a good thing. I think that it would have been lost on me had he handled it a little bit differently.
Okay.
It's definitely a shorter conversation in the movies, but I think the
very abbreviated
intensity
compared to the chapter, for sure. And I understand that. I'm not a movie critic. It's just that I do think that it was painted a little bit more sinister in the opening to the movie, and I think that that was probably a good thing for someone like me who didn't have this background.
Yeah.
I thought that it was a good choice for what it's worth.
That's interesting, because I wonder if so I actually read part of this chapter from the book itself. Like, I didn't listen to it, which for me is like, that doesn't happen that often. Okay. And I thought, like, I missed the audiobook because, and I think what you said there kind of ties into this, it's being mildly acted out. Like, Andy Serkis in these audiobooks is like doing the voices. He's like yelling when they're yelling. You know what I mean? And you don't always get that when you're just reading. Like, obviously, if the context clues are there, you might, but you're not necessarily going to give the same tone that, you know, the narrator would, or they would in the movies. And so I think it really, I think the intensity was there in the audiobooks, because I think Andy Serkis gave it the intensity that it needed. But that's interesting that on the page it didn't read that way.
Well, and I also kind of read fast. Like, we've talked about it. Like, I kind of read fast, and so, but I got through it, and I was like, that didn't feel as scary. And maybe I had drawn it out. Maybe I read it a little flat. Like,
well, it's also, I feel like Gandalf in the writing is much more level up until the point that Bilbo threatens him with a sword, and then he gets bigger and it gets darker. But he is trying to have a logical conversation with a 2-year-old throwing a temper tantrum about, this is my ice cream, I don't want you to take my ice cream, which is kind of what Bilbo is doing. I found it fair and square. It's mine. And
it's mine.
Like, and he called me names, and you're calling me names. And Gandalf is like, I did not call you names. I did not say anything like that. I just asked you a question.
Right. Yeah. And I love that tension actually had, like, it was built up because apparently Gandalf digging out the actual story from Bilbo had made Bilbo kind of mad. Like, he, you know, it put a little bit of a wedge in their friendship, apparently, because Bilbo did not want to fess up to how the exchange actually happened.
Well, and Gandalf even says in this chapter, he's like, it's a magic ring. This is part of my profession, and magic rings are by themselves curious objects. That's not the exact words that he uses, but he's just like, oh, there's, you know, like, and he's probably already thinking, like, about all the types of rings that are out there.
Right. So with Frodo tying up all the loose ends from the party made me laugh. I took several notes, but one of them was the specific, you know, bequeathments or whatever, the people who received very particular gifts. So I wrote down, we had a guy who got an umbrella because he had taken many unmarked umbrellas, a pen for someone who never responded to letters, a bookshelf for a guy who wandered off with books and never returned them. Like, the snark for me, like, once again, Bilbo in The Hobbit, time and time again, was so relatable. But in this little section, it reminded me of our relatable king. I don't know. It was lovely.
But I would say, like, he's a little sharper now.
He
you
is.
Know what I mean? Like, so there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with a zinger, or, you know, one good turn deserves another, right? Like, getting in the last word, like, oh, for all those letters you write. You know, I get it. I get it. But I feel like Bilbo pre-Hobbit, never would he ever have done that.
Yeah. He's older now. He doesn't have as many cares to give, basically.
Yeah.
So speaking of our relatable king, Jessica, how do you feel that he is no longer our main character, and officially he's out? Like, we're moving on to other protagonists.
I mean, I'm a little sad, but at the same time, I'm glad that he started us off. I'm really, I love that. I don't know if it matters as much to folks who didn't read The Hobbit, but for me, for my read, I'm super excited that we started with Bilbo.
Yeah, it was nice to have him there again. So Leigh-A, I wanted to ask, so Tolkien has a really distinct voice that we've talked about. It comes through in his works, and in my opinion, I think Jessica would agree. So is there anything you particularly like or dislike about his style that you encountered either following along while we were reading The Hobbit or so far in the Fellowship?
I felt like this chapter kind of continued the voice from the Hobbit. So it was the very quirky and, quick storytelling, over elaborating, under elaborating. And it may be because it is a Bilbo chapter and it was very Bilbo focused that voice did carry through, which I was very surprised, because I do remember from my past readings, like The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy do have very different tones. And I think, and again, the only thing I can think of is it's the Bilbo chapter. It's his POV, air quotes, maybe. I don't know.
Sure.
So it kind of translated, at least in this first chapter. We're getting we're like coming down, we're in transition right now from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings still.
And The Hobbit, even when there were heavy chapters, it was overall very lighthearted.
It was.
And so, not to give too many spoilers, but this trilogy is not super lighthearted.
Not all the time. But this chapter, though,
this chapter is.
Look at Kritter. For right now, we are fine.
We are fine. It's fine.
It's fine. It's fine. We're all fine. Nothing's going to go wrong at all.
Oh, good. All right, so Gandalf stops by to warn Frodo again about the ring before he takes off well ahead of schedule, because he's like, you know what, I need to go. Clearly, he's like, I need to go check some stuff out about this here ring. Was there anything that stood out to either of you that we haven't talked about this Frodo-Gandalf interaction?
For me, it was Gandalf do be Gandalfing with his expect me when you see me and look out for me, especially at unlikely times.
Yeah, like, great. So if I'm expecting you, then I shouldn't. But then, please make it make sense. Gandalf.
Yes.
Also, what do you even say?
Where was Gandalf staying? Because Frodo was expecting him to stay a long time.
A week.
And he leaves that night to go somewhere and comes back later the next day after everybody else is gone. Where is he staying?
How many Hobbit beds does it take? How many Hobbit beds does it take to make one Gandalf bed?
I don't know. Bree is like not a quick ride away. It takes a while to get to Bree, so it's not like there's anywhere else in the Shire that he's staying. Is he sleeping under his cart?
I think there's an inn, surely, in the Shire.
They don't really have many visitors. The only one I can think of
is the Prancing Pony, but that's Bree, isn't it?
Bree.
Well, okay, so there's the pub, though, and, in fantasy world, sometimes pubs equal inns, right? It's like a tavern or whatever.
Maybe.
Because I don't want to, spoil anything, but we do get introduced to a place called the Green Dragon in the next chapter, and I can't remember if that's an inn or if it's a pub.
Sure.
But who knows? Maybe Gandalf has a girlfriend. We don't know. He wanted to shack up that night before he left, okay? Can you blame him?
Sweet Georgia Brown.
He took an interest in Hobbit lore for a reason, okay? And now we know what the reason is. That's all I want to say. Okay. All right, we can move on. Sorry, you seem very uncomfortable, Jessica, and I apologize. Gandalf's not allowed to have girlfriends, apparently. Sorry, Gandalf. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1. We are starting a new tradition, Leigh-A, so you're in on this new tradition for the very first time, where we pick an MVP for every episode. So, cue the music. if there's music, whatever. Who's it gonna be? Who's the MVP from the prologue, the foreword, and chapter 1?
For me, I would say that I can't do Frodo because he's too obvious.
Okay.
So I'm going to go Peregrine, because Peregrine's going through all that in the aftermath post party. And also there was some fun stuff in the foreword about him for his future self. So I'm going to go with Peregrine too.
Wait, I thought Mary was the one helping Frodo out.
I thought it was Mary.
Oh, crap. You're right. It was Mary.
Okay, so it's Mary. And you know what? Very relatable to get those two mixed up. Let's be honest.
They're usually come as a set, so
they
it's a little hard.
Do. Yeah, we didn't really mention Mary was he was wingmanning Frodo, trying to get people out of his house, which was like, I love to see that Frodo's got a good friend.
Mm-hmm. So that was the criteria for me. Completely arbitrary criteria was I thought Mary, got a good buddy award for chapter 1.
I love it. Leia?
Gonna go with Gandalf for the amazing fireworks and also helping Bilbo hide the fact that he has a ring that makes him go invisible, which he has hid from the world. So when Gandalf just lights off some sort of sound magic fire explodey thing as Bilbo is putting on his ring. Talk about good wingmans.
Covered for him. Okay, Gandalf, yet another excellent wing. So there's no requirement that I have to pick somebody different, and I'm not going to. So I'm gonna pick Gandalf also for a different reason. He was a really good wingman covering for Bilbo whenever Bilbo put on the ring like a little silly fool in front of everyone. But mainly for me, Gandalf wins it because he convinced Bilbo to leave the ring, which is an incredible feat, and that Bilbo definitely would not have done without Gandalf's help. And basically that is the catalyst for what's about to happen. So as the first episode of season 1, season 2, it felt appropriate that the person who really kind of pushes the plot forward should get the award, and that person for me was Gandalf. So great. So if we're tallying the votes, it sounds like Gandalf wins the majority with a nice little nod to Mary for being such.
I'm gonna have to make a spreadsheet about it. It's gonna be an overall season winner, I think.
I think you're right. I think we need an overall season winner. Okay, so
spreadsheets, yes.
I'll own that. I'll take that action item.
Jessica's going to do the spreadsheet.
I will say it was hard. Those two are very hard to choose, and I think just because Mary's only mentioned so quickly that Gandalf wins out. That's the only reason. It's just Gandalf just does a little bit more.
And honestly, Bilbo was also in the back of my mind just for the snark. but the fact that he tried to keep the ring, we had to give it to Gandalf because he convinced him not to. Okay, so anything we didn't cover in our forward prologue, chapter 1, that you all want to talk about before we sign off?
Just a real quick note on the gift giving. Bilbo did give some very kind gifts to some lesser fortunate hobbits. So some people walked away with a whole bunch of food and just a whole bunch of things that they would need and that those people were very appreciative of. So
good point.
He wasn't just the people who deserved it got it, and then the people who deserved it got it.
So true. That is such a good point. One of the older Gamgee, the gardener, also he was one of the fact that he got several sacks of potatoes really made me smile, just because we know how much Sam Gamgee loves a good potato. So I like that a lot. Good point. I'm glad you called that out. All right, Jessica, anything before I do the sign off? No.
I'm looking forward to next week,
where we will be reading chapters 2 and 3 of The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. So if you're reading along with us, make sure to read chapters 2 and 3 by next Tuesday. And I just want to say thank you so much for tuning into episode 1 of season 2 of But Are There Dragons, brought to you by your hosts Jessica Sadai and Kritter XD. And thank you, Leia, for joining us. today. It was a pleasure to have our first ever guest. You nailed it, I think.
Yes.
So don't forget to follow us at But Are There Dragons on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, and But Dragons Pod, just 1T on X. You can also find your hosts on social media as KritterXD and Shelf Indulgence. That's it for today. We're workshopping new catchphrases for Season 2 after Never Laugh at Live Dragons won out in Season 1, so let us know on social media how you feel about this one. Goodbye, dear listeners, until our next meeting.
Bye.
Bye.